Now let's tell you about a dangerous encounter. It happened on Saturday between the Australian and Chinese Defence Forces. This was a mid-air altercation. It happened in the Yellow Sea. A chopper from the Australian Navy was in the region. It was on a routine patrol mission to enforce UN sanctions on North Korea. You see, Australia supports United Nations sanctions on North Korea. So this mission was aimed at keeping Pyongyang in check. But suddenly, a Chinese warplane appeared out of nowhere. It flew close to the Australian chopper, and then the Chinese jet deployed flares. What are flares? They're like fireworks coming out of a plane. Pilots typically use flares as a defensive measure to protect their aircraft from incoming missiles. So flares are a safety tool. But in this case, China used them as a weapon to provoke or scare off the Australian chopper, which managed to dodge the flares. But this has sparked a diplomatic war now. Canberra has slammed the Chinese military.
On the incident that we have reported on, we have made very strong representations at every level to China about this incident, which we regard as unprofessional and unacceptable.
Unprofessional and unacceptable. That's what Australia is calling China for putting their chopper at risk. Thankfully, no one got hurt, but it could have gone either way. This episode, or incident, as the Australian Prime Minister calls it, has put Anthony Albanese in a tough spot. That's the Australian PM. Since coming to power, he has pursued a détente with Beijing. Albanese inherited a broken relationship with China. His predecessor was Scott Morrison, who took on Beijing publicly. Morrison was the first world leader to demand an investigation into the origins of the Wuhan virus pandemic. He asked China to cooperate in this investigation, and this demand, of course, led to tensions. China responded with a wave of economic curbs. It even detained Australian nationals. Albanese has been trying to reverse that. He came to power 2 years back, and he's been at it since. Last year, he paid a visit to China. He sat down with Xi Jinping. The trip raised hopes for a reset. Australia and China were mending ties. But Beijing's provocations over the weekend could undo a lot of this progress. Albanese says he wants to keep talking to China, but Beijing is a tricky customer, unpredictable and unreliable. It is already blaming Australia for Saturday's incident.
The
truth is that the Australian military aircraft, under the banner of implementing the UN Security Council resolutions, deliberately approached China's airspace in a threatening way that jeopardized China's maritime and air security. The Chinese military took necessary measures at the scene as warning, and the relevant operations were legal, compliant, professional, and safe.
Let me simplify that statement for you. China is basically calling Australia a liar. It also says the Australian chopper approached Chinese airspace, and the actions of the Chinese pilot were defensive in nature. That's Beijing's position. It will be tough for Albanese to keep the dialogue going in circumstances like these. Apparently, he plans to raise this issue again in the month of June. That's when the Chinese premier is scheduled to visit Australia. Meanwhile, the Americans have expressed concern about this incident in particular and China in general. The US says the PLA is becoming more aggressive. That's the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, PLA. They're becoming more aggressive in the waters surrounding China. And the US forces have been at the receiving end. Last year, a US Air Force plane was flying over the South China Sea. A Chinese fighter jet buzzed the American plane, and they've done the same with Canada. This was in October last year. A Canadian chopper was in the South China Sea. A Chinese jet approached the aircraft and deployed flares. It was a close call. Canada said the chopper could have drowned, but Beijing refuses to change its ways. In fact, it has only expanded such operations, which is both dangerous and reckless. A small misstep could trigger a major conflict. In the past, both the US and Canada have issued statements. They have protested against China's actions, but Beijing is yet to change course. Australia should be aware of this reality and seek a more robust deterrent against China.
Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alison Lagrange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. South Africa goes to the polls on the 29th of May. I will track the election and bring you ground reports. Is it the end of the road for the African National Congress? And will former President Jacob Zuma stage a dramatic comeback? From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global south. Join me every weekday live on First Post.